The air was heavy that night, thick with salt and fog, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel damp. I remember thinking it was strange that Vanessa had asked me to meet her there, at the old pier, long after sunset. She said David wanted to talk, something about family matters, something private. Fool that I was, I went, because when it comes to your only child, even after the coldness, the distance, the way his wife had slithered her way between us, you still hope. You hope for a moment of love, a flicker of the boy you raised. Her heels clicked against the wood as we walked side by side. David stood a few feet ahead, his back to us, staring out at the restless waves. I called his name, but he didn't answer. He didn't even turn his head. That was my first real warning, his silence. Vanessa leaned close, so close I could smell the sharp tang of her perfume mixed with the sea. Her lips brushed my ear as she whispered almost tenderly,
"Time to meet your end."
And then the shove came. Not violent, not frantic, calculated, just enough to unbalance me to send my aging body stumbling toward the edge. I caught a glimpse of David at the last second, his eyes finally meeting mine. Not pleading, not horrified, just empty, and then the water swallowed me whole. The cold was merciless. It shocked the breath out of me, dragged me under before I could even scream. My dress tangled around my legs like seaweed, my arms clawed uselessly at the current. Salt burned my throat, my lungs. Above, I heard faint laughter, footsteps retreating. My son's shadow loomed on the pier, still and unmoving. He wasn't coming. He was never going to. Panic flared, but something stronger followed. Rage. Rage that after everything I had given him, his education, his home, his father's fortune, this was the thanks. Rage that Vanessa's poisonous smile was the last thing I might ever see. I kicked hard, forcing myself back to the surface. The night sky split into fragments above me, blurred by water and tears. "Help!" My voice cracked, swallowed by the roar of the tide. The pier was already fading into mist, their silhouettes gone. They had left me for dead. Every instinct screamed to fight, but the cold gnawed at me, numbing my fingers, slowing my limbs. My hip ached with each desperate kick. The thought struck like lightning. So this is how it ends. Not with dignity, not with love, just a shove and silence. And then, a light. Weak at first, then brighter. The steady hum of an engine cutting through the night. A fishing boat, lantern swinging as it approached. A voice, gruff and startled. "Holy hell, hold on!" Strong arms grabbed me, hauling me over the edge like I was nothing more than a half-drowned catch of the day. I collapsed onto the deck, coughing seawater, shaking so violently I thought my bones might crack. The man crouched beside me, his weathered face lined from years of salt and sun. "What happened to you, lady? You fall in?" I wanted to tell him the truth, that my own son and his wife had tried to kill me. But the words stuck in my throat, because even then in my sodden, shivering state, I knew one thing. If they thought I was alive, they'd try again, and maybe next time. I wouldn't be so lucky. So I swallowed the truth, coughed until my lungs burned, and whispered, "Please, don't tell anyone you found me." His brow furrowed, but something in my eyes must have told him enough. He nodded slowly. "All right, my name's Frank. You'll be safe tonight. But whoever put you in that water, they ain't done with you." He wrapped me in a blanket that smelled of diesel and brine, and I sat there trembling, staring out at the black horizon. Somewhere beyond that fog, my son and his wife were already writing their version of the story. An accident, a tragedy, an old woman too frail for her own good. But I was alive, and that was the one thing they hadn't planned for. They thought the waves would erase me, but I decided to let them believe I was gone. And from that night on, I swore I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to make them pay. When people ask me now if I saw it coming, I always hesitate, because the truth is, I did. The signs were there, but when it's your own child, you look away. You excuse, you convince yourself you're imagining things, and that blindness nearly cost me my life. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. It started small. Little comments Vanessa made at family dinners. "Don't worry, Mom, we'll take care of everything when you're older. You won't have to stress about money or decisions." She said it with that sugar-sweet smile of hers, but her eyes told another story. Calculating, assessing. At the time, I brushed it off as kindness. Then came the pills. After my hip replacement surgery, I was groggy, exhausted, and in pain. Vanessa insisted on organizing my medication. "You just focus on healing," she'd say, taking the bottles from the pharmacist before I could even read the labels. Twice I found myself dizzy, disoriented, unsure if I'd taken the right dosage. I chalked it up to age, but now I wonder, was she already setting the stage for my memory decline? David changed too. My son, who used to call me every Sunday just to chat, now only rang when he needed something signed. Documents, authorizations, transfers. "It's just to make things easier, Mom. Taxes, medical bills, you know how complicated it all gets." He'd slide the papers across the table, his hand firm on the pen as if daring me to hesitate. I trusted him. He was my son. I signed. One evening still haunts me. I'd misplaced my reading glasses, nothing unusual, but Vanessa pounced. "See, this is what I've been saying, David. She's been so forgetful lately." She said it lightly, almost joking, but she was filming me with her phone while I fumbled through my purse. I remember feeling a strange chill, as though I'd stepped into a play where I didn't know my lines. Even my doctor seemed different. Appointments became shorter, his tone more clipped. "Perhaps consider assisted living down the road," he said once without explanation. Later, I learned he'd stopped returning my calls entirely. At the time, I thought he was just busy. Now I wonder if he'd been pressured or paid. And then there was the house, the one Robert and I built our lives in. After he passed, I signed it over to David, thinking it would bring him closer to me, give him stability. But slowly, I was treated like a guest there. My opinions dismissed, my belongings packed away. Vanessa redecorated everything. "A fresh start," she said. I should have realized then. I was being erased piece by piece. But the clearest red flag came the week before the pier. David called me, his tone unusually warm. "Mom, we should do something special for you. A family evening. You deserve it." My heart ached with hope. Maybe he missed me. Maybe he wanted to reconnect. When I arrived that night, Vanessa handed me a glass of champagne almost before I'd taken off my coat. She toasted to new beginnings. David asked casual questions about my will. He said probate could be such a nightmare and hinted that I should simplify things for them. His words were smooth, but his eyes were cold, like he was already rehearsing my obituary. The final straw. The moment that should have shattered my denial was when I caught Vanessa tilting her phone, recording me while I sipped champagne, pretending to take a selfie but angling the camera toward me, documenting my slurred words, my confusion, my supposed incompetence. They weren't just plotting, they were collecting evidence. And still, I ignored it. Because he was my son, because I thought family meant something. Now, replaying it all in my mind, I can see how carefully they built their case. The pills, the papers, the staged moments of forgetfulness. They wanted me to look weak, unstable, ready for the narrative they were crafting. The old woman who slipped, who drowned, who couldn't manage her life anymore. Standing on that pier, as Vanessa's whisper cut through the fog and David stood frozen, I realized every red flag I'd ignored had led me to that moment. But here's the thing about survival. Once you've clawed your way out of death itself, the blinders fall away. You stop making excuses. You stop ignoring. You see every detail with clarity. I wasn't the helpless woman they painted me to be. I was alive. I was furious. And for the first time in months, I was wide awake. They thought they had written the ending to my story, but I was just beginning to write theirs. I always thought funerals were for closure, for saying goodbye, for honoring the truth of a life lived. But sitting there in the back of a dark sedan, a black veil draped low over my face, I realized funerals can also be a stage, and mine, my own, was nothing but a performance. Rain slicked the cemetery grounds, turning the grass into mud and the gravestones into black mirrors. From where I sat on the hill, the scene unfolded like a play. A polished casket sat at the center, draped in white lilies. My photo, carefully chosen, was perched on an easel beside it. I recognized it instantly, a picture Vanessa had once insisted on taking mid-sentence when I looked distracted and weary. Now it was being used as the final image of who I supposedly was. I pulled my borrowed coat tighter and forced myself to watch. David stood at the front, his arm around Vanessa's shoulders. His suit was perfectly tailored, his tie straight, but his face was empty. He held a folded piece of paper, and when he spoke, his voice cracked just enough to sound rehearsed. "My mother was struggling these past few years," he said. "She wasn't herself, but she was loved. She deserved peace. And now, she finally has it." The words landed like stones. He was rewriting me right there in front of everyone, painting me as frail, confused, a burden to be pitied. Vanessa sniffled into her tissue, dabbing her eyes dramatically, leaning into him like the dutiful wife. She whispered loud enough for the nearest row to hear, "She's in a better place." I gripped the seat in front of me until my knuckles turned white. What made it worse, what cut deeper than the lies, was the crowd. Friends I had known for decades, neighbors who'd shared holidays with me, women from my book club, even the pastor from the church I once attended. They all wept. They believed every word. My life had been reduced to a tragic story of decline, and my son and his wife were the narrators. But as I scanned the faces, something caught my attention, or rather, the lack of certain faces. My lawyer, Patricia, absent. My accountant, Michael, not there. My financial advisor, Richard, missing too. These were people who should have been present, should have offered condolences, should have at least made an appearance for a woman whose estate was worth millions. Their absence spoke louder than the pastor's prayers. They weren't just missing, they were avoiding. My stomach twisted. Were they already part of this? Had they helped David and Vanessa script my downfall? The pastor closed his Bible, his voice soft against the patter of rain. "We commend Margaret Harrison to the sea of eternity." My name, spoken as if I were truly gone, echoed across the cemetery like a verdict. Then came the moment that nearly broke me. Eleanor, my neighbor of 30 years, stepped forward, her frail hands clutching a handkerchief. She sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking, and placed a single rose on the empty casket. "Goodbye, Margaret," she whispered, her voice cracking. She believed I was gone. She grieved for me while the real villains stood just feet away, pretending to grieve too. I wanted to run to her, to tell her I was alive, to hold her hand and promise that the truth would come out. But I stayed hidden, because revealing myself too soon would mean death, this time permanent. Vanessa dabbed her eyes again, though I noticed she peeked at the crowd between gestures, gauging their reactions like an actress reading her audience. When the service ended, she and David moved through the mourners like politicians at a rally, hugging, nodding, accepting condolences. Every word of sympathy they absorbed was another brick in the wall of their deception. From my seat in the shadows, I whispered the promise that kept me breathing. "You will choke on these lies, both of you." The car door opened and Frank, the fisherman who had saved me, slid into the driver's seat. He'd insisted on accompanying me, worried I'd do something reckless. "Well," he asked, glancing in the rearview mirror at the sea of black umbrellas. "They buried an empty box," I said flatly, "but the story they buried me with is worse than death." He studied me for a long moment. "You sure you're ready for what comes next? Exposing your own son?" I looked back at David and Vanessa, now laughing softly with a couple by the grave, as though death were just another social event to navigate. My jaw tightened. He stopped being my son the moment he chose silence on that pier. What's left is just another enemy. As the car pulled away, the rain turned heavier, drumming against the roof like applause. Not for them, for me. Because while they were congratulating themselves on their flawless performance, I was already planning the next act. They thought they'd buried me, but I was watching, listening, waiting, and the day would come when I'd turn their show into a trial. The night I broke into my old house, the one I had signed over to David after Robert died, I felt more like a thief than a homeowner. The irony was bitter. A house built with my money, filled with my memories, and yet I had to sneak in like a criminal. Frank dropped me off 3 streets away, insisting he'd circle the block in case things went wrong. "You're not as invisible as you think, Margaret," he warned, handing me a small flashlight, "and if they catch you—" "I won't let them," I cut in, but my voice trembled. The key was still on my ring. David had never asked for it back. A small oversight on his part, but one I planned to use. I slipped through the back door, careful not to let the hinges creak, and the smell hit me first. Not the familiar warmth of old wood and Robert's cologne lingering in the hall. No, this was different. Sterile, expensive, like a showroom pretending to be a home. Sheets covered the old furniture, but underneath I saw gleaming leather couches, a massive television, artwork I didn't recognize. My kitchen was stocked with imported cheeses and fresh produce, things Vanessa never bothered with before. They weren't just visiting, they were living here, enjoying what I had built as if I were already gone. I moved carefully, every creak of the floorboards sounding like thunder to my ears. My heart pounded, but anger kept me steady. It was in Robert's old study that I found the truth. The desk was neat, but too neat. Stacks of papers aligned perfectly, folders labeled with chilling precision. One in particular caught my eye. Project Margaret. My breath hitched. I opened it, and the contents spilled like poison. A timeline of my supposed decline, dates, notes about memory lapses, records of me confusing names, even photos, me at David's birthday party last year, looking bewildered. I remembered that moment. They hadn't told me it was a surprise party, and I walked into a room full of strangers expecting a quiet dinner. They'd captured my startled face and labeled it as evidence of dementia. Another page described the hospital mix-up 3 months ago, when I'd been rushed in for taking the wrong medication. I'd blamed myself, but the notes in Vanessa's handwriting told the real story. Switched labels successful, incident documented. I gripped the desk to steady myself as the realization crashed over me. My son and his wife hadn't just tried to kill me at the pier. They had been killing me slowly for over a year, crafting a narrative of incompetence until I was nothing more than a senile old woman in the eyes of the world. But the worst discovery wasn't in the files. It was upstairs. I climbed the staircase, each step groaning under my weight, and paused at the end of the hall. A faint sound drifted from a room that used to be my sewing room, a soft whimper, a baby's cry. My pulse spiked. I pushed the door open just enough to see inside. The once cluttered room had been transformed into a nursery. Pale blue walls, a crib with silk blankets, toys neatly stacked in bins, a mobile spinning lazily above a sleeping infant. I pressed a hand to my mouth. Vanessa had never been pregnant. I would have known. So whose child was this, and why was it in my house? I stepped closer, peering at the baby's face. Peaceful, innocent, utterly unaware of the evil surrounding him. On the dresser, I saw documents, hospital forms, a birth certificate with Baby Harrison typed neatly. Vanessa listed as the mother, David as the father, but I had seen Vanessa in a bikini just a month before. She hadn't carried a child. The paper shook in my hands, a forged baby, a fabricated heir. The floor creaked behind me, and panic jolted through my veins. I snatched the documents, shoved them into my coat, and ducked out the back door before I could be caught. My lungs burned as I hurried down the dark alley where Frank was waiting. He opened the passenger door and froze when he saw my face. What happened? I shoved the crumpled birth certificate at him. They didn't just plan to erase me, Frank. They've created a replacement. His eyes darkened as he read. That's not just greed. That's something much darker. I stared back at the glowing windows of my house stolen from me in every way. They weren't just trying to inherit my fortune. They were building a legacy on lies, down to forging bloodlines. And in that moment, drenched in sweat and shaking with fury, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't dealing with desperation anymore. I was dealing with a conspiracy. They hadn't just tried to kill me. They had built an entire world where I never existed, and now I was going to burn that world down. For days after breaking into my house, I barely slept. The image of that crib haunted me. Its polished wood, the soft hum of the mobile, the innocent face of the baby who shouldn't exist. My son and his wife hadn't just tried to kill me. They had staged an entire replacement for me, a forged bloodline. I knew then that if I tried to fight this alone, I would lose. I needed allies, but choosing whom to trust was like walking a minefield. One wrong move and David or Vanessa would know I was alive. So I started with the only person I knew wouldn't betray me, Judge Evelyn Harper. Retired, sharp as ever, and a woman who had been both my neighbor and friend for decades. Evelyn had seen it all in her courtroom. Frauds, betrayals, families tearing each other apart. If anyone could help me, it was her. When I showed up at her door, dripping from the rain with a crumpled file of forged documents in my bag, she didn't flinch. She listened in silence as I told her everything. How Vanessa shoved me into the water, how David stood by, how I'd watched my own funeral from a hilltop. When I finally stopped, shaking from both exhaustion and fury, Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady, "this is bigger than a greedy son and his wife. What you've described is systematic, methodical. They're not the only ones involved." I slid the birth certificate across the table. "Then explain this." She adjusted her glasses, scanning the page. "This isn't just forged. This was prepared with legal precision. Someone with insider access, a lawyer perhaps, or a network." Her words chilled me. A network. That explained the missing lawyer, the silent accountant, the evasive advisor. They weren't uninvolved. They were complicit. Evelyn leaned closer. "You need someone who can dig deeper, someone who doesn't play by the book anymore." She picked up her phone and made a single call. That's how I met Daniel Crawford. Daniel wasn't just a private investigator. He had been an FBI field agent once, until politics drove him out. His reputation was mixed, ruthless, relentless, willing to bend rules. When he walked into Evelyn's kitchen the next morning, he brought an air of danger with him, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. I didn't sugarcoat it. My son and daughter-in-law tried to kill me. They forged my decline, staged my death, and are now raising a child that isn't theirs. And I want proof, enough to bury them. Daniel studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You're not just a victim. You're angry, that's good. Anger keeps you alive." He set down a battered leather bag and pulled out equipment. Cameras, voice recorders, files. He spread them across Evelyn's table like weapons. "Tell me everything, every name, every document, every whisper you remember. If there's a network, I'll find it." For the next hour, I laid it all out. The pills switched. The staged surprise party photo, the legal documents David pressed me to sign, the absent professionals at my funeral. Daniel scribbled notes, his jaw tightening as the picture came together. Finally, he looked up. "You're right. This isn't just inheritance greed, it's organized. I've seen similar patterns before. Elderly targets isolated, painted as incompetent, then conveniently dead while heirs inherit everything clean. Your case might be the one that cracks it open." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "But only if we're careful. One wrong move and they'll know she's alive." Daniel nodded. "Then we play it smart. We let them think they've won while we turn the knife behind the curtain." That night, Evelyn offered me her spare room. I lay awake listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in her hallway. Every second another reminder that time was against me. David and Vanessa were moving quickly. If they secured legal control of my estate, unraveling it would be near impossible. At dawn, Daniel returned with photographs. Grainy surveillance shots of Vanessa meeting a man outside a glass high-rise downtown. The man's face was sharp, his suit expensive, his briefcase sleek. Daniel laid the photo in front of me. "Recognize him?" he asked. I studied the image, my heart sinking. "Yes, that's Richard Carlisle, my financial advisor, the one who stopped returning my calls." Daniel smirked grimly. "Around here they call him RC. A fixer for the wealthy. He helps greedy families accelerate inheritances. The word caught in my throat. Accelerate. Daniel leaned back. That's the polite term. I'd call it assisted murder. The room went quiet. Rain tapped against the windows and the weight of his words pressed down like a stone. So it was true. I wasn't just fighting my son and his wife. I was fighting a machine that preyed on people like me, elderly, wealthy, vulnerable. But what they hadn't counted on was this. I wasn't gone. I was alive, and I had allies. I looked at Daniel, then Evelyn, and said the words that sealed my path forward. If they built a machine to erase me, then we'll build one to destroy them, piece by piece. The night I decided to walk back into that house, I wasn't the same woman who had been shoved into the sea. Fear still lived inside me, yes, but it was buried under something sharper, resolve. If David and Vanessa thought they had written my obituary, then I would write the ending to their story myself. We staged it carefully. Evelyn worked her contacts in law enforcement, ensuring we'd have officers standing by, ready to move in when the time came. Daniel set up hidden recorders and cameras in the house, careful to place them where Vanessa loved to gloat. Every detail was mapped, every risk calculated. Still, I knew once I crossed the threshold, it would all come down to one thing, whether I had the courage to face them. I chose Vanessa's bedroom for the confrontation. Poetic, I thought. Let her taste the humiliation of walking into her sanctuary and finding me, alive, waiting, smiling. The night they were expected back, I sat in the armchair by her vanity, the lamp casting my shadow tall against the wall. My heart pounded, but my face stayed calm. In my lap rested a manila folder stuffed with photographs, forged documents and recordings, all the evidence we'd gathered. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the quiet house. Muffled voices drifted up the stairs, their laughter, their certainty. They believed they had won. The bedroom door creaked open, and there I was. Vanessa froze in the doorway, her purse slipping from her shoulder and thudding to the floor. For a heartbeat, she looked like she'd seen an actual ghost, her eyes wide, her mouth trembling before the scream tore out of her, a raw, piercing sound that rattled the windows. David followed behind, his keys still in his hand. He stopped cold, his face draining of color as he whispered, "Mom." I leaned back in the chair, folded my hands and smiled. Surprised? I suppose the dead don't usually sit in your bedroom waiting for you, do they? Vanessa stumbled backward, shaking her head. No, you drowned. We saw... Her words collapsed into silence. David's lips parted, but nothing came out. The son I had raised, the boy I had once cradled, now stared at me like I was his reckoning. I placed the folder on the vanity, spreading its contents across the polished surface. "You've been busy," I said, my voice steady. "Forged medical notes, altered prescriptions, photos designed to make me look senile, even a birth certificate for a child that isn't yours. Tell me, Vanessa, whose baby is sleeping down the hall?" Her mask cracked. I saw the flicker of panic before she snapped back, spitting venom. "You can't prove anything." That was the moment Daniel had been waiting for. From the adjoining room, he stepped out with a small recorder in hand. He pressed play. Their voices filled the bedroom, Vanessa whispering about my memory lapses, David agreeing to push for legal control of my assets. Their own words, captured, undeniable. "Consider it proven," Daniel said coldly. Behind them, 2 uniformed officers entered. Evelyn followed, her presence commanding, her eyes locked on me. "Everything's in place, Margaret," she said. "They're not walking away from this." Vanessa's composure shattered. She lunged toward me, her face twisted with rage. "You should have stayed dead," she screamed. An officer caught her by the arms, twisting them behind her back as she thrashed. David just deflated. His shoulders sagged, his head bowed. "Mom," he whispered again, but there was no conviction. No apology, only emptiness. I stood slowly, the years of pain and betrayal heavy in my bones, but balanced by the weight of triumph. I stepped closer until I could see the fear trembling in Vanessa's eyes. "Do you know what the ocean taught me?" I asked softly. That drowning isn't the worst way to die. Betrayal is. The officers pulled her from the room, her screams echoing down the hallway. David didn't resist when they cuffed him. He simply stared at the floor, silent as he had been on the pier. I turned to Evelyn and Daniel, my voice clear, steady. "It's over." Daniel shook his head. "No, Margaret, this is just the beginning. Carlisle and his network will come for you next. But tonight you won." As the house filled with the sounds of radios crackling and evidence being bagged, I stood at the window looking out at the same city where they had tried to erase me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. They wanted me dead. Instead, they had to watch me rise, and I made sure the last thing Vanessa would ever remember was the sight of me smiling in her room, alive, unbroken, untouchable. The days that followed felt unreal, as though I were walking through a movie in slow motion. One moment, I was the drowned woman no one was supposed to see again. The next, I was sitting in a courtroom, alive, watching my son and his wife face the consequences of what they'd done. The trial was swift but brutal. Evidence piled up higher than the flowers at my fake funeral, the forged medical files, the staged videos Vanessa had collected, the fraudulent birth certificate, and then the recordings, their voices, planning my downfall, conspiring to erase me. Vanessa tried to put on another performance, the way she had at my funeral. She wept on the stand, claimed she was manipulated, claimed she had only ever wanted what was best for the family. But the jury wasn't fooled. They heard the venom in her voice, the cruelty laced in every whisper. David was different. My son sat pale and silent, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of every lie pressed down on him. He didn't fight. He didn't deny. When asked why he didn't stop Vanessa on the pier, he simply said, "I was afraid." Afraid of her. Afraid of losing the money. Afraid of being less than what he thought he deserved. But fear is no excuse for watching your mother drown. When the gavel struck, the sound reverberated through my bones. Vanessa, 25 years without parole. David, 20 years for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. I didn't cry. My tears had dried the night they left me to die. And then came Carlisle, the great fixer, the man who profited off other people's grief, who engineered inheritances soaked in blood. Daniel's investigation tied him to at least a dozen other suspicious deaths, all hidden behind polished paperwork and carefully staged accidents. When his empire fell, it made headlines across the country, a syndicate of greed and betrayal, dismantled piece by piece. Justice, yes, but justice never erases the scars. What stayed with me wasn't the courtroom or the verdicts, it was the quiet moments afterward. Walking through my old house, now mine again, and pausing in that nursery. The crib was still there, the toys stacked neatly, and in that crib lay the baby, innocent, untouched by the darkness swirling around him. I reached down, brushing my fingers against his tiny hand. His grip tightened instinctively, warm and strong. My throat caught. They had forged his existence, twisted his identity into a weapon, but he was real. A life that deserved better than the lies he had been born into. Through Evelyn's guidance, the court granted me guardianship. The truth unraveled, surrogacy gone wrong, a young woman silenced to cover tracks, paperwork doctored to make the child look legitimate. That young mother's name was buried in files, erased like mine almost had been, but I refused to let her vanish. I gave the child her name, tied forever to the truth. Raising him became my second chance. Not to replace what I had lost, but to honor what had been stolen. Each morning when I saw his eyes, deep, steady, innocent, I remembered the vow I'd made in the water, to survive, to fight, to reclaim. Now years later, people ask if I ever forgave David. I think about that night on the pier, the way he looked at me as I fell. He wasn't a stranger, he was my son, and that made it worse. Silence can be sharper than a knife, heavier than a shove. His silence killed the boy I had raised long before I hit the water. Forgiveness? No. Some betrayals don't deserve it. But I learned something far more important. Family is not defined by blood. Blood can betray you, sell you, drown you. Family is loyalty. Family is the ones who pull you from the water, who sit beside you when the world believes you're gone, who fight for your truth even when it's dangerous. Evelyn, Daniel, even Frank, the fisherman who saved me without asking questions, and now the child who grips my finger with trust instead of deceit. They are my family. As I sit here now, the waves rolling beyond my window, I sometimes hear Vanessa's voice in my memory. "Time to meet your end," she had whispered. But she was wrong. That night wasn't my end. It was my beginning. And I made sure the last image she carried into her cell was me, sitting in her room, alive, smiling, surrounded by officers and lawyers. The ghost she thought she drowned turned flesh and bone, carrying the one thing she never had, the truth.